Everybody, thank you for joining us. We're very lucky to have Rabbi Jonah Pesner here with us. He serves as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism and has led the Religious Action Center since 2015. Rabbi Pesner also serves as senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism, a position to which he was appointed in 2011. Named one of the most influential rabbis in America by Newsweek magazine, he's an inspirational leader and tireless advocate for social justice. Rabbi Pesner's work focuses on encouraging Jewish communities to reach across lines of race, class, and faith while campaigning for social justice. In 2006, he founded Just Congregations, which is now Religious Action Center, which engaged clergy, professional, and volunteer leaders in interfaith social justice efforts. Rabbi Pesner was a primary leader in the Massachusetts campaign for healthcare access that has provided a coverage to thousands and became a model for nationwide reform. Over the course of his career, he has also led and supported campaigns for racial justice, economic opportunity, immigration reform, LGBTQ plus equality, human rights, and a variety of other causes. He's dedicated to building bridges to collectively confront anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate. Rabbi Pesner is a visiting scholar at Harvard University, speaks regularly on college campuses, has trained students on all 4 campuses of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and gives speeches in interfaith and secular venues all over the world. Rabbi Pesner serves as a board member of the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the National Religious Partnership for the Environment, and the New England Center for Children. He's a member of the Faith-Based Security Advisory Council for the Department of Homeland Security, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation Solidarity Council on Racial Equity, and the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. He has served as a scholar for the Wexner Foundation, the Chautauqua Institution, American Jewish World Service, the Nexus USA Summit, and Combined Jewish Philanthropies. Rabbi Pesner was the co-editor of Moral Resistance and Spiritual Authority, Our Jewish Obligation to Justice, wrote the afterword to the newly published Social Justice Torah Commentary, and is a widely published author. Ordained at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in 1997, Rabbi Pesner was a congregational rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston, Massachusetts, and at Temple Israel in Westport, Connecticut. A graduate of Wesleyan University and the Bronx High School of Science, Rabbi Pesner is married to Dana S. Gershon, an attorney. They have 4 daughters, Juliet, Noah, Bobby, and Kate. Rabbi Pesner, the stage is yours.
Oh, Isaac, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And Isaac, thank you for everything that you did to get us organized today. It is an honor to be here in the home adjacent to Rav Shmuley, my beloved colleague and friend who has changed the Jewish social justice landscape with his leadership and all of the Uri Litzedek people around him. I want to also give a shout out to Eddie Chavez Calderon, who is the original author of the invitation for me to join this teaching session. So Eddie, thank you. And thank you to all of the wonderful people, friends of Uri Litzedek. You truly are light and justice. My predecessor, Rabbi David Saperstein, who ran the Religious Action Center before me for 40 years, prophetically and famously used to say, social justice cannot just be the purview of the Reform Jewish movement. We need our Orthodox and other Jewish family to join us in the work of centering Tikkun Olam and the pursuit of justice as core Jewish activities. Because if it's just some Reform Jewish thing, it can be dismissed as being fringe. But when our friends in the conservative, Reconstructionist, and yes, the Orthodox Jewish world stand with us, rooted in thousands of years of Jewish text and tradition, proclaiming the importance and the centrality of tzedek in our tradition, then it is clear that it represents the mainstream of Jewish thought, Jewish history, and Jewish peoplehood. I would add, for everybody watching, recognition that every time the Pew data comes out, every time there's a Jewish values study, the number one thing that most Jewish people report is core to their Jewish identity is Judaism's commitment to repairing the world, to pursuing justice, to doing the thing that God calls us to do, which is to protect the widow, the orphan, the stranger, to uplift the poor. These are the values that come together around centering the most marginalized in the middle of our camp. And that is both a Jewish particularistic, Jewish peoplehood expression, and it's also a Jewish universalistic expression. I also want to acknowledge at the beginning of this conversation, if you ask certainly American Jews, and I would argue global Jews as well, what is the number one thing that most Jewish people do? Even more over and above going to Shabbat, observing kashrut, attending high holiday services. If you look at the full array, the most secular to the most engaged religiously and halachic Jews, the number one thing that most Jews would all say they do is attend a Passover Seder. This is borne out by the data. And I ask myself, what is the impact on a people when every year the number one thing that most of us do is show up to the sacred reenactment where we tell the story of our enslavement and then our liberation? When we hear the words of the commandment that we are to see ourselves as if we as individuals were enslaved in Egypt, and as if we ourselves were liberated from our bondage and could make our way to the promised land. What is the impact? What is the impact when every year we come together and we reenact that drama with all of the Seder rituals, all of the props and all of the costumes and all of the storytelling, because we're commanded that we are to teach our child on that day that it was for us that we were redeemed from Egypt. And then that our text goes on to say, because we were liberated from Egypt, 36 different ways, 36 different times in our tradition, the text tells us that God enjoins upon us, because you were a slave in Egypt, you are to love the stranger. Think about that now. It doesn't say tolerate. It doesn't say put up with. It says to love the stranger. There's real ramifications when we're obligated to not just make space for those who are different from us, but to figure out how to actually love them. And by the way, I should note, only once in our text, in our Torah, does it say, you are to love your neighbor, your fellow, the person who is proximate to you. But 36 times it says we're to love the stranger. Now, maybe that's because it's 36 times as difficult to love a person who is other, different, or maybe it's that it's 36 times more important. But be that as it may, that is the commandment which we're commanded. And when you hold the loving of the stranger adjacent to the oft-repeated text that I alluded to before, that we hear again and again in our tradition, that we are to uplift the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, that we are to protect the poor, this is our biblical injunction. The rabbis teach that those categories, one who is poor, one who is an outsider, one who is a widow, one who is an orphan, what they all have in common is they don't have the typical protections of a tribal society. They are literally the most vulnerable. And so the text is telling us our enslavement in Egypt, our personal experience of slavery, whether it was our ancestors thousands of years ago, or because of the radical empathy that our Seder and our Haggadah are calling us to, that we're to see ourselves in that liberatory moment, that radical empathy of experiencing enslavement ourselves is to then have empathy for the person who is currently enslaved or vulnerable or marginalized. That has real ramifications. By the way, I would also add to this framing in Jewish text and tradition of why we pursue justice, we combat racism, and we think about deeply anti-Semitism, even when it's really hard, a continued teaching that comes out of the Hasidic tradition. We know that as soon as the Israelites escaped our enslavement in Egypt, the first tribe or community that attacked us as we were making our way, and you have to imagine, this was a ragtag group of former Hebrew slaves, our ancient ancestors, who had spent generations, hundreds of years in enslavement, had almost nothing, were suffering, living in the wilderness, and then were attacked by Amalek, whose name we are commanded to blot out because of the evil that he perpetrated upon us. And one of the things that the rabbis point to that made Amalek and his attack on our community so vicious and evil was that he attacked the stragglers at the rear, those who were slow, those who were infirmed, those who were elderly, those who were not able. But the Hasidic masters had a very agitational teaching. The sin, they argued, was actually not the sin of Amalek for attacking us at our rear. The sin was the sin of the children of Israel, that we allowed there to be stragglers at all. That we, who are the people that are supposed to have the radical empathy with all those who are suffering, who are to center the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor, should never have allowed there to be stragglers at all. And so this is the Jewish textual frame that I want to offer for this sacred conversation about why we do this work. Because Jews don't look outside and blame suffering or injustice on others. We hold ourselves accountable. We say to be Jewish, to be authentically living the commandments of our Torah and our text, is to center the most vulnerable. And shame on us if there are people who are suffering. Shame on us, whether they are Jewish, non-Jewish, whether they are descendants of the children of Israel or otherwise. By the way, it's worthy to note, our ancestors, the rabbis, also taught that every human is created from that same original first human. We're all descendants of that first human that God created, so that no person could say, your ancestors were better than my ancestors. One of the reasons we pursue racial justice, we seek to defend and protect all vulnerable minorities, whatever racial or religious backgrounds they come from, is because in truth, we're all descended from that first human. In fact, there's a beautiful midrash that when God took earth to create that first human and breathed life into them, God reached all four corners, taking clay and sand and loam and soil. And why? Because reaching to all those four corners meant that there was red, there was black, there was yellow, there was white in all of the materials that went into making the first human. God intended the creation that we live in, the human being, the people of the human family, to be multiracial and gorgeous in the tapestry of the interracial and multi-faith reality of our creation and our existence. So for me, when people get into a false dichotomy about Jewish particularism versus Jewish universalism, the question of should we lean into Jewish peoplehood or to a universal approach to all of humanity, for me, they're all the same. Because to be a particularistic Jew, to lean into our Torah and our tradition, is to be concerned with the other, every Jewish other and every human other. I want to close this piece of the textual framing by making an argument that our redemption actually did not end with the parting of the seas and our entering into the wilderness. We weren't just liberated when we left the enslavement of Egypt. I would actually argue that our redemption of a people, our transformation from a people enslaved to a people who are free, happened at the mountain when we received the Torah. And we didn't just leave behind oppression. We didn't just get the freedom to do, we gained the freedom to be obligated, to actually limit our freedoms, the freedom to enter into covenant, the receiving of the Torah. There is a wonderful set of midrashim, of legends, about Moses, when Moses was in the wilderness before he went back to go and lead the Jewish people in their uprising against enslavement and their exodus. When God appeared in the bush and then God appeared and called Moses to go back, people may know in the text many times Moses argues back with God. Moses says, well, I'm of limited speech. How will I speak to the children of Israel? And God says, well, don't worry. You'll have your brother Aaron. You'll have Miriam. You'll have people with you, you'll have the elders. And Moses keeps arguing. Well, the rabbis make up a midrash. And in the midrash, they describe a scene in which Moses has one last argument. The people, Moses says, the Israelites, are not worthy of redemption. In other words, they don't deserve it. And God pauses and says, Moses, what makes you say that? And Moses, according to Midrash, says, their mouths are full of lashon hara. Their mouths are full of evil speech, which in rabbinic tradition, lashon hara literally means the evil tongue, but it also is translated as gossip. So they're gossiping. They have bad words in their mouth. And God says, Moses, what evidence do you have? And Moses references the fact that the Israelites are gossiping when they say to him, when they try to intercede in a fight between two Israelites, two Hebrew slaves, they say, well, aren't you the one who murdered the Egyptian taskmaster? And Moses realizes the matter is known and he has to escape from Pharaoh. But the Midrash is using the fact that the Israelites are talking about Moses to have Moses make the argument that they have evil speech in their mouth, that they're gossiping, and therefore they're not worthy of redemption. Well, God pushes back, and God pushes back hard, according to the Midrash. God says, no, Moses, because after you liberate the children of Israel, in 6 weeks' time, they will gather at the mountain, and they will say the words, Na'aseh v'nishma. All this we will do and we will hear in response to the offer to enter into the covenant, to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. That is to say, God transforms this motif of the mouths of the Israelites being full of evil speech to being full of covenantal speech, the entering into covenant, the opportunity to live in a society which, as I said earlier, centers the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor, that actually says, we care for everyone as part of this covenant. In fact, Martin Buber, who wrote the famous book, I, Thou, described this Sinaitic moment, the moment of the mixed multitude standing at Mount Sinai, accepting the covenant, saying, Na'aseh v'nishma, all this we will do and we will hear, as the ultimate I, Thou moment. And Emmanuel Levinas, riffing off the theme, in essence made the argument that when the Israelites entered into the covenant with what Levinas called the ultimate other, capital U, capital O, i.e. God, it was a proxy, a way to enter into covenant, not only with the ultimate other, i.e. God, but every other human. And so that covenantal moment was the culmination of the liberation from bondage, the opposite of slavery, the opposite of oppression, the opposite of bondage isn't just freedom to go do whatever you want. No, friends, the opposite of enslavement, oppression, and bondage is covenant, is community. We are a communitarian religion. We don't just believe in individualism, self-actualization. We believe in communal obligation that has ritual and traditional ramifications about the way we celebrate together, the way we pray together, the way we observe together. And it has ramifications about our ethical obligations and commitments to care for every other. So that was a long-winded way, Isaac and my friends from Uri L'Tzedek, to frame why we do racial justice, why we combat anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry and hate, why we resist authoritarianism, and why we center the most vulnerable, even when it's hard. And friends, just to acknowledge, this is a hard moment. We have seen unprecedented examples and uptick in anti-Semitism. Attacks on Jews. Obviously, October 7th continues to loom what many have described as the worst pogrom against the Jewish people, the worst single day of violence against Jews since the Holocaust in many of our lifetime. And it is coincidental with a rise of authoritarianism, an anti-Semitism that is aligned with a kind of a white supremacy, a kind of a neo-Nazism, a kind of a xenophobia, and a hatred of the other that is deeply alarming to us as Jews in our particularistic way, but also as Jews who are human, who care about every other, and who understand that, as Dr. King used to say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it didn't just begin on October 7th. This rise was happening before. So I want to now pivot to think about these issues in historical context of where at least I sit as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And I realize I'm speaking to an audience largely of modern Orthodox Jews who've made the commitment to center justice, Uri L'Tzedek, in your work. And so I reiterate what I said earlier about Rabbi Saperstein. This can't be some Reform Jewish thing. This has to be a Jewish thing in which all of us, whatever our expression or our self-identification of the way we're Jewish, joined together in a shared commitment towards justice. But I'm going to tell the particularistic story of how the Reform Jewish movement leaned into racial justice, combating racism and anti-Semitism at the same time, in a way that I hope will invite other streams of Judaism, and particularly my Orthodox family, to see themselves as part of it. It all begins with an incredible story about a man named Kivi Kaplan. And by the way, Kivi Kaplan, though he was the descendant of immigrants who, like many of us on this call, came to this country with nothing, seeking the land of opportunity, he became a very successful businessman, very wealthy person, and then, of course, became very philanthropic and very generous and wanted to pay it forward. He was a Jew from Boston. So, Isaac, I give you that shout out because I know you just left Northeastern University, and I, too, was a rabbi in Boston. In fact, I was a rabbi at Temple Israel in Boston, which was where Kivi Kaplan was active and on the board. And he became a board member of the Reform Jewish Movement's national institution, what we now know as the Union for Reform Judaism. But his philanthropy was defined by the following experience. When he was a young newlywed with his wife, Emily Kaplan, they went on their honeymoon to South Florida. But this was during the Jim Crow era. Sorry, just got a call on my phone. I apologize. It was my daughter who lives in Boston, Isaac. So there you go. He was on his honeymoon in South Florida with his new wife, Emily. It was during the Jim Crow era of separation, obviously, segregation and oppression of Black people. And he kept seeing a sign he had never seen before all over these country clubs in Florida. No Jews, no dogs. And Kaplan was shocked. Coming from the Northeast, he had never seen the sign before. He turned to the Black taxi driver who had been driving him around and asked if this was common. And the African-American taxi driver looked at Kivi and said, "They don't even bother with us." And as we say in Hebrew, nafal ha'asimon, the token dropped. It's an old reference in Israel when their payphones all had tokens. So your call would go through and the token would drop. Kivi realized oppression of one minority leads to the oppression of all minorities. If they come after one, they come after all of us. That this overt expression of anti-Semitism was deeply rooted in anti-Black racism. And when Kaplan came back and decided to focus his philanthropic and volunteer activity, he became very active in the NAACP, which at that time was largely a coalition of white Jews and Black Christians. And friends, for those that don't know this, Kivi was the last white Jewish president of the NAACP at the time that he stepped down in the mid-70s. And he was determined that he would be the last white person to lead what is now a Black-led organization. I sit, as Isaac said earlier, on the board of the NAACP in a seat that traces itself from Kivi Kaplan through David Saperstein, and now I have the honor and the privilege of sitting in that chair. But the other thing that Kivi Kaplan did was he bought an embassy-sized building in DuPont Circle in our nation's capital and gifted it to the Reform Jewish movement. And he said, you can have this building, which is magnificent. It's 5 stories, it's historic. But he said, there's one caveat. You will only receive it if you commit to be the hub for the civil rights movement. Now, remember, this is the Jim Crow era. Dr. King did not have an office in Washington. And so it was that Rabbi Dick Hirsch, my predecessor, before Rabbi Saperstein, who was the inaugural director of the Religious Action Center, his first act as director of the center was to call his dear friend, a young, dynamic pastor named Martin, and say, good news, Martin, you have an office in Washington. The Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, which I now also serve on the board of, was hosted in the offices of our center, which meant that the lawyers of the Leadership Conference, again, many white Jews, many Black Christians and other, would sit in our offices. They would draft the legislation that would become the defining victories and successes of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were drafted in our conference room in a Jewish institution. Many of us on this call don't even know that bit of history. But I want to remind you, for Kaplan, who was a deeply committed Jew living a Jewish life, who experienced anti-Semitism, enabled this multiracial interfaith effort for civil rights, for racial justice to happen in a Jewish institution because he understood that civil rights is a Jewish issue. And lest we forget, by the way, the risk and the costs. My friend, Reverend William Barber, who is the visionary leader of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and a friend of Rav Shmuley's as well. Famously, when I got up in 2016 in a voting rights convening when we were down in North Carolina to mobilize voters, mostly underrepresented voters, and I told the story of the Religious Action Center, Reverend Barber got up and said, Rabbi Pesner, I want to issue a correction, a Talmudic emendation, if you will, because sometimes our clergy partners know our text better than us. And his Talmudic emendation was to say, the Voting Rights Act was not written in our conference room in Selma, in our conference room in Washington. It was written in blood in Selma. And it was transcribed in your conference room. That is to say, that Goodman and Cheney and Schwerner went down during Mississippi summer, and we are now in this summer of voting rights. We are in a summer where tens of thousands of Jews across the spectrum, I know 10,000 Reform Jews as part of our campaign called Every Voice, Every Vote, but many people in the Jewish community are in vulnerable communities right now, registering voters, engaging voters, having conversations about the important ways in which we beat back against oppression and racial injustice, anti-Semitism and oppression, is through an expansive democracy, a democracy in which every voice is heard because every vote is counted. By the way, another historical footnote before I get to the present day, and I promise I'll get to the present day in a moment. Rabbi Dick Hirsch, who marched with King in Selma and did it as a rabbi, and did it because he was friends with King and he was his brother in the struggle, and was the founder of our RAC in Washington and brought in the leadership conference. That same Rabbi Dick Hirsch made Aliyah to Jerusalem and was the founder of the Israel movement for progressive Judaism, the Reform movement in Israel, which gave rise to the Israel Religious Action Center, our sister organization in Israel, which fights for racial justice and for peace and for equity in Israel. And Rabbi Hirsch, his memory for a blessing, we only lost him just a year ago or so, used to famously say that Zionism is a social justice ideology. For him, he marched with King not only as a Jew, he marched with King as a Zionist because he understood what I understand. My Zionism is the liberatory historic struggle of the Jewish people to live freely in their land, and in the spirit of Achad Ha'am and Martin Buber and Abraham Joshua Heschel, for all people to live freely in their lands, which I would argue extends, of course, to the Palestinian people who have the right to live freely in their land and have the right to national aspirations. I say all of this because it's impossible to think about social and economic justice, racial justice here in the United States, in North America, and across the world without thinking it deeply in our beloved homeland, the land of Israel. The liberatory struggle did not just end in the entry into the promised land. It is when we bring that Torah into the promised land and we make sure that the land reflects the same social justice values of lands where we live anywhere. And that applies to Jewish people to live securely and freely in a democratic state where their voice is heard, and every voice of a democratic state of Israel is heard, not just the Jewish residents of Israel, and our neighbors have the freedom and the ability to live in peace and in security as well. And so that brings us to today, because the disruption of October 7th and the trauma that we're still living through, and I want to invoke that on this day, as I'm giving this talk, families of the hostages who are still being held right now in Gaza are making their way to Washington to lift their voices as the Prime Minister of the State of Israel is about to address in 2 days' time a joint session of Congress to cry out to the United States and to the world, don't forget the hostages. Jews, Muslims, non-Jews, Americans, Israelis, internationals still being held. And because we know of the gender-based violence, the sexual assault and the rapes, being held in conditions we could only imagine of the horror. And we're living in the trauma, not only of the massacre and the murder of that day. And I've been to Kfar Aza, I've been to Nova, I've seen for myself the violence of that day. And I've talked to the survivors and to the women who were impacted by the gender-based violence. And so I know what the trauma has done. And the disruption and the horror of that day has, in this moment in which we have to lean into our combating anti-Semitism and our fight for racial justice and the safety of all people, including our Muslim family, and to combat Islamophobia, we have to go upstream to see the source of some of it even before October 7th. So I mentioned the Voting Rights Act, which was written in our conference room, because injustice doesn't just happen from rhetoric and violence, it happens from policy. We knew things were getting bad in this country, in the United States, in 2013, when the Supreme Court issued a historic ruling called Shelby v. Holder. Shelby v. Holder, in essence, eviscerated the Voting Rights Act because it eliminated preclearance. Preclearance was the provision of the Voting Rights Act that, in essence, said states with historic patterns of voter suppression, racialized voter suppression, couldn't make any changes to their voting laws without preclearance from the Department of Justice. And the rationale of the court at the time, in an opinion authored by Chief Justice Roberts, the logic, in essence, and I'm oversimplifying this for the sake of time, was things are better now. Things are better now. Well, anybody that has lived in the United States for the last decade knows, from a racial justice perspective, from a white supremacy perspective, from an anti-Semitism perspective, things are not better now. In fact, God bless her, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, her memory for a blessing, famously said in her withering dissent of the Shelby v. Holder decision that the logic of the court is a little bit like standing in a rainstorm under the protection of an umbrella and throwing away the umbrella and saying, we don't need this anymore because I'm not getting wet. Well, now we have seen state after state after state that has passed racialized voter suppression laws. And this all comes in the context of the plea that we heard in 2015 with the voices of Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and so many others crying out saying Black Lives Matter. And because of the complicated politics of the Middle East, Jewish people in America, some of us were slow to adopt the understanding that the same fight we were in the 1960s around civil rights and racial justice was the fight that says Black Lives Matter. It took until George Floyd and the plea of 2020 and the plea of Black Jews and brown Jews and Jews from other marginalized backgrounds saying, our lives matter, see us. 15% of the American Jewish community is not white. Jews are Black, they are brown, they are Asian, they are Latino, they are Latinx, they are gay, lesbian, straight, and queer. They cut across the whole spectrum of American society. They are people with differing abilities and disabilities. We are the multiracial, multi-ethnic community of diverse backgrounds that looks like America. And therefore, when we say Black Lives Matter, we say it as a Jewish value. We say it both because of the Jewish history and text that I taught earlier around the way in which we're all descendants of one ancestor, that God created the first human from black and red and yellow and white from all four corners of the earth. But we also say it because the Jewish people are Black and brown and other. It is a Jewish value and rooted in Jewish peoplehood to say that Black Lives Matter. And the Tree of Life shooting, to invoke our 11 Jewish family who were gunned down on Shabbat morning in worship. And when I was in Pittsburgh in the hours after the shooting, what I witnessed was breathtaking. It was, remember, 2 years after Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, chanting at a Confederate statue. So here you have these replacement liars, these AK-47 or whatever they are, AR-15 toting goons with their tiki torches chanting at a Confederate monument representing oppression of Black people. Jews will not replace us. 2 years later, we knew that the violence of the rhetoric that we saw in Charlottesville would become the violence that we saw in Pittsburgh. But what did I see in Pittsburgh? Tens of thousands of people came to Soldiers and Sailors Hall the night after for a vigil. They were Black, brown, white, Asian, Latino, across the full spectrum of the racial array of Pittsburgh. They were Muslim, Christian, Jew, and other, all together in solidarity to stand with the Jewish community. And the Muslim community of Pittsburgh committed to help support and defend the Jewish people in Pittsburgh and raised money for the families that were impacted. And Reverend Vincent Kolb, a prominent Black pastor, said 3 things that I hold to this day, even when it's hard. Number 1, he said. This was an attack on Jews, full stop. And when you attack Jews, you attack all of us. Number two, he said, this was an attack on a synagogue that was standing in solidarity with migrants and refugees because it was Hayas, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society Shabbat, a Shabbat of standing in solidarity with refugees and migrants. And we are a solidarity city in Pittsburgh, and we stand with the most vulnerable. And he said, let's also remember that 3 days ago, 2 Black people were shot in a supermarket that was targeted because the church that the shooter had wanted to invade was locked. And the reason that Black church was locked, because Black churches now lock their doors because of the Mother Emanuel church shooting some years earlier, in which nearly a dozen Black worshipers were shot by another white supremacist. And so what we know is this replacement lie, this notion that there is a conspiracy led by Jews to turn America Black, brown, and Muslim through immigration policy and expanding the electorate and voting rights is as dangerous in its rhetoric as it is in its violence. That's why we stand together. By the way, when Kolb was done speaking in October of the 2018, just before the midterm elections, the people in the hall started chanting, vote, 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 because we understand that it's our democracy that will protect us. I believe, even now, our safety is in our solidarity as Jews with all those who've experienced oppression and bigotry, and our redemption as a nation. Just like our redemption as a Jewish people came through the moment at Sinai when we entered into covenant, our redemption as a nation, this United States of America, will be through democracy, when we are actually the multiracial, inclusive democracy, when every voice is heard, because every vote is counted. Now, I know what some folks on this call are thinking. What October 7th revealed was not only that the threats to Israel and to Jewish safety in Israel from Iran and her proxies, Hamas, and the other violent actors that would commit a true genocide against the Jewish people if they could. And we like to say, when people say they want to murder Jews, believe them. And by the way, I say this as a person committed to social justice, to a two-state solution, to peace with our Muslim, Arab, Christian, and Palestinian neighbors who survived in the year 1995, a bus bombing, who went to 3 different funerals of 3 different friends who were murdered on buses by Hamas. I know exactly who Hamas is and what they do. But I made a commitment back in 1995, in the wake of the trauma and the terror of the Hamas bombings and the loss of my friends. I made a commitment to Matthew and Sarah, Matthew Eisenfeld, Sarah Duker, and Joan Devaney, their memory for a blessing, who were murdered by Hamas, that I would not let Hamas steal my humanity. In the face of inhuman acts, I lean into the humanity that God gave me. And so after October 7th, not only was revealed the true threat to the Jewish people, but there is an anti-Semitism among too many in the community that we think is a community of solidarity around racial justice, voting rights, a more just and equitable world. There are bad actors, there are anti-Semitic actors who couldn't find a way to condemn what Hamas did, who pivoted way too quickly to focusing on Palestinian human rights and Palestinian suffering without acknowledging the trauma and the reality of Jewish suffering. We know that that's true. That's there. So then the question is, what do we do? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, then we're not going to do the sacred work that God has called us to do for thousands of years? To not just tolerate the stranger, but to love the stranger when they say things and post things and tweet things that are hard, to dismiss them? Or to double down on relationship and listening and solidarity, even when it's hard. So friends, here's what I'm going to say. As a rabbi and as a Jew who toils in the vineyard of multiracial interfaith social justice work, as loud as the outlying voices are that are anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and anti-Zionist, there are many, many, many more voices of solidarity, of people who are thoughtful and reasoned. I would call people's attention again to Reverend William Barber, who wrote a brilliant piece in The Guardian in the wake of the October 7th massacre, who clearly made a case that an act like the acts that Hamas committed, gender-based violence, rape as a weapon, massacring and murdering innocents and children, is never justifiable in a protest struggle or a struggle for liberation, ever, full stop. These are the kinds of voices that our allies in the work for social justice say and need to be amplified and heard, but don't make the headlines and don't make the press. Doing the actual work requires that we get into deep relationship across lines. We listen to Black pastors, we listen to Latino Catholic parishes, we listen to Asian Americans, and yes, we listen to our Muslim and Palestinian neighbors, and we hear their perspective. We share our own and hold them accountable that they need to hear ours. This is the work I do every day. And the conversations aren't always pleasant, and they don't always go the way that we want, but we do it, and we do it for two reasons. One, because the work of social justice is the right thing to do. We don't just do it from a utilitarian perspective to build more allies for the Jewish people. That is a good ancillary benefit of doing justice, that it does build allyship, but it's not the primary driver. The primary driver is tzedek, tzedek tirdof. You are commanded to pursue justice, to pursue it twice, to pursue it double, to pursue just means and just outcomes. Because the widow, the stranger, the orphan, and the poor are at the center of the community we're trying to build. That's why we do it. And we do it to be in right and sacred relationship. And we do it because Jews are impacted by those systems of injustice. And we do it because when we are in right relationship with our allies across lines who understand the threat of white supremacy, who understand the threat to democracy of authoritarianism, populism, when we do that in a multiracial and interfaith way, we can make the case for anti-Semitism and help people understand that when they use a trope, like saying, well, Jews do have all the power, or Jews really are, that we can call a timeout and say that's anti-Semitism. When people challenge us on our Zionism, we can call a timeout and say, what do you mean by Zionism? And do you know what I mean when I say I'm a Zionist? And can you hold space for the way that I see my Zionism as a liberatory movement that actually leads to a world in which all people can be safe and be free? That, to me, is why we do this work. We do it because it's right, because it's just, and it's what God calls us to do, and because I believe with all my heart and soul that if we create a multiracial, inclusive democracy here in the United States where we have a vote and where we can build our power, and when we partner with our Israeli family to build the multiracial, inclusive democracy that's possible in the Middle East and for Israel, alongside a Palestinian state, then we can realize the redemption of standing at Sinai, entering into the covenant, not only with the Holy One, blessed be the creator of all people and all of creation, but also into covenant with other, not just the Jewish other, but every other. That was long. I probably overstayed my welcome, Isaac. I'm going to pause there and I turn it to you.
Not at all, Rabbi. We really, really appreciate that. And as someone who grew up in a house hearing stories like what you told today, especially the Kiwi Kaplan one and the cab driver, it's just so good to hear. And then we do have a couple of questions. One is in the chat, one was a message to me, personally. I'll read it out loud. We're living in frightening times, and I agree that there are many voices on our side. But the other side is just much louder and more vocal. How do we engage without sometimes feeling like we're lowering ourselves to what has reached a very low level? Very frustrating, but stooping is not something we do well, nor should we.
Amen, sister. So thank you, Debbie's iPhone. I should say, amen, Debbie. Thank you, whoever you are and whatever your work is. I will lovingly just offer one piece of feedback on the way you frame the question. I try and live in the world as it should be. The world of covenant, where everybody can stand at the mountain and enter, and it's not a Na'aseh v'nishma. We here. I try and not be about us and them, our side, their side, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, red, blue. Those are, to me, false binaries. Us and them. God created a world in which we can actually stand together at the mountain and hold our differences. And we need to model that internally, even as we are reaching out beyond our own boundaries, and then model that externally. So what I mean when I say that, and I try and hold myself accountable, is the world is full of noise. It is full of mean-spirited, authoritarian, racist and anti-Semitic nonsense. I try and lean into what I can do. Sacred conversation, thoughtful dialogue, relationship building, and I know that agitation. It's hard to get that to scale. Right now, in this social media infused universe where a tweet can go viral and millions of people are posting on Instagram, how do you be human and sacred inside of that? I don't have an easy answer to it, Debbie, but I know that if we all tried to do it, even in our social media footprint, even in our kind of virtual relationships, to be curious, to be affirming, to be kind, we could create a culture in which people are invited into covenant. By the way, when people that I have any relationship with act in ways that I think do put them on the side of kind of, being inhuman or unrelationable, I try and get at a conversation and I try and be curious what's behind it. But maybe is that Debbie off your iPhone? Hello, Debbie. Thanks for going on camera. Appreciate it.
All right. Now, thank you for the wonderful answer, Rabbi. Now we got another. Um, how do we handle the current challenge of continuing to stand for the rights of other minorities and people when it seems more and more the people we are standing with to help others are not also standing with us?
Well, I really appreciate in the question. I mean, this is kind of what we've been talking about, right? And I know it's hard, and I'm going to say two things. One is the key, I think, to part of the question is when it seems that people are not standing with us. There are three baskets of people, right? There are the people that have really just turned their back. And sometimes when someone turns their back on you, there's one of the most upsetting moments in the biblical text is the moment where God turns God's back on Moses and says, "You will not see my face." This is one of the most heartbreaking moments. To turn one's back is the ultimate betrayal of relationship. If someone has truly turned their back, live and be well. We have to go where we can face one another, panim el panim, face to face. There's the basket of people who quite clearly and obviously stood with us as we stand with them, and we should continue to stand with them and thank them. But that group of people in the middle where it seems that they've turned their back, I had a great conversation with a rabbi, a wonderful Zionist, liberatory social justice rabbi in northern New Jersey, who said to me after October 7th, the same clergy who reached out to me after Tree of Life, their silence was shocking and deafening. And I said to him, "Well, did you call them and tell them what you need?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Well, can you imagine why for a lot of these pastors and a lot of these religious leaders, October 7th feels a bit more challenging and complicated and a little harder than a Tree of Life, which seemed simpler to them?" He said, "Oh, that's a good point." He called them, convened a meeting, and they thanked him and said, "We really didn't know what to do or think." My point is that it's when we say it seems that many of our allies have turned their back, we need to interrogate that and we need to invite discussion, relationship, and conversation. I'm not saying it's always going to go well. I've had disappointing conversations. I will be honest with you. There are people I have worked with for decades who I now feel that we will respectfully disagree, but probably not do a lot of work together. But then there are the people, because I've done the investment in the time, I've been listening and curious. What's at stake for them? Why is it hard for them? What are they feeling torn about? What do they need help understanding? And are they willing to hear my deeply held beliefs and story? More often than not, I'm rewarded for that patience and that investment. By the way, one other tip that I want to give, very practical tip. Way too often in these conversations, people are talking from positions. Well, I think this. How could you say that? You tweeted this, but I believe that. And you're not going to get anywhere. One of the most important skills I've learned is to say, "Isaac, is there a story you can tell me to help me understand where you're coming from, why you believe what you believe? And can I tell you a story about my own experience?" Often when I hear the person's story, it humanizes what's really happening for them, and our stories help each other connect. In fact, I specifically told the story about my experience surviving a bus bombing in 1995. I tell that story to my interfaith allies because I want them to understand the reality of what happens on the ground in Jerusalem with a bus bombing or a terror attack, and not just think of it as some political, kind of abstraction. But I also want to know from them, like, what story has led you to have this belief so that I can really try and live and walk in your shoes.
Thank you for that, Rabbi. We appreciate you, I guess, expressing how important it is to understand other people's views, opinions. And we got another question from Pam Ovshinsky. What are our next steps and how do we begin to engage? Can we have more training in this in our movement?
Amen. Hello, Pamela. Good to see you, Pam, or hear from you. Thank you for joining. Yeah, I mean, I think the work is hard, and we just finished a four-part series for more than 150 rabbis and cantors to do skill building on this very topic. How do you lean into relationships and into these coalitions, even when it's hard, and with practical kind of skills? And maybe, Pam, what you're suggesting is we need to do this, offer these kinds of trainings for lay leaders. So I make this invitation. If there are people that have an interest or a commitment that want to understand, how do you do a one-on-one conversation? How do you host a house meeting to surface people's stories? How do you try and build shared values and shared understanding even when there's disagreement about policy? How do you reach out to interfaith allies outside of yourself in ways that build bridges rather than burn them? We'd be happy to do that.
All right. Well, I think that is it. And if that is no more questions, we'll conclude the Zoom.
Buddy.
Rabbi, thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you everybody for coming. And this will also be available on our Spotify page and Apple Music. So if you want to re-listen, find it there. But anyway, thank you so much to everybody for coming and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everybody. It's a blessing to be with you.